At 7:42 on the morning of March 14, 1941, Beatrix Schilling stood on the tarmac at RAF Kenley watching a Hurricane pilot climb into his cockpit for what might be his final mission. She was 32 years old with 6 years at the Royal Aircraft Establishment and still no working answer to the issue that was costing pilots their lives. That week the Luftwaffe had sent 43 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters across the Channel. RAF pilots had engaged them in 27 separate dogfights. 14 Hurricanes had been lost along with 9 Spitfires. The pattern never changed. A British pilot spotted a German fighter and pushed into a dive to attack. The engine cut out. The German aircraft escaped or returned and fired on the stalled Hurricane while the pilot struggled to restart the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Schilling had reviewed combat reports and maintenance logs and had spoken with surviving pilots. The carburetor flooded during -G maneuvers. The explanation was simple physics with severe results. When a Spitfire or Hurricane entered a sudden dive, fuel rushed to the top of the float chamber. The jet starved and the engine stopped for about 1.5 seconds. That short gap allowed a Messerschmitt to close in and fire. German aircraft did not face this issue because their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. Without a float chamber there was no flooding. Bf-109 pilots could dive, climb, roll or invert without losing power. This created a clear advantage in every fight. British pilots understood it and German pilots used it fully. Squadron reports confirmed it, and the Royal Air Force was losing skilled pilots faster than they could be replaced. Schilling had spent 11 months working on the issue. Engineers at Rolls-Royce were developing a pressure carburetor as a full solution, but it would not be ready until 1943 or later. The war could not wait and neither could the pilots. Each morning young men entered Spitfires and Hurricanes knowing their own engines might fail before enemy fire reached them. Squadron leader Davies walked past Schilling toward his Hurricane. He was 24 with 41 combat missions and 3 confirmed victories. He had reported engine failure twice in the last month, both during combat dives, and had survived through luck and long training. He nodded at Schilling and she returned the gesture. He did not know she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough and likely assumed she was an office worker. Schilling had brought a small brass component with her that morning. It was carefully made and extremely simple. Her team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had tested it on a bench engine for 6 weeks and it had worked. However, bench testing was not the same as combat. Combat meant high speed and strong -G forces and decisions made within seconds. Schilling walked to her Norton motorcycle. Inside her leather satchel was the brass restrictor and a plan that would either help the Royal Air Force or end her career at Farnborough. By midday she would know the result. The carburetor problem had begun in July 1940 when the Royal Air Force switched to 100-octane fuel. Higher octane allowed greater boost, which increased the Merlin engine output from 1100 to 1310 horsepower. The Spitfire Mark II could reach 370 miles per hour in level flight fast enough to challenge the Bf-109. However, the SU carburetor could not handle the -G forces of high-speed combat. Schilling understood carburetors better than anyone at Farnborough. She joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, 1 month after war was declared. She was one of only 2 women in the engine department and the other was a secretary. Schilling served as principal technical officer responsible for carburetor research and development. Many of her colleagues had never worked with a female engineer and some doubted her place there. She ignored those views and focused on keeping pilots alive. She had grown up working with engines. At 14 she bought her first motorcycle, a Norton, and took the engine apart piece by piece to learn its function before rebuilding it. At 25 she raced that same machine at Brooklands, reaching an average speed of 106 miles per hour and earning the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star. Only 3 women had achieved that award and Schilling was the second. Racing taught her how engines behaved under stress, including high G turns, rapid acceleration and extreme lean angles. She learned to sense what an engine required before instruments showed it. That instinct made her the leading carburetor specialist in Britain. Now pilots were dying because their engines could not cope with combat conditions. The solution came to her in January through basic physics. Flooding occurred because fuel could flow freely when gravity reversed. If the flow was limited, flooding could be prevented while still supplying enough fuel. The idea was a brass disc with a precisely sized hole placed in the fuel line before the carburetor to control the flow. She produced the first version herself with a thimble shape measuring 0.125 inches in diameter and a central hole of 0.4 inches. The exact size was critical. Too large and flooding continued. Too small and the engine would not receive enough fuel at full power. She tested 17 variations before finding the correct dimensions. Then she simplified the design to a flat washer which was easier to produce, install and replace. Bench tests confirmed its effectiveness during simulated negative G conditions. Still, she needed real combat testing. Gaining approval was difficult because unauthorized changes to RAF fighters broke multiple regulations. If the device failed and caused a death, she could face severe consequences. She chose to act first and deal with the results later. That morning at Kenley she carried 6 restrictors and relied on a ground crew sergeant who trusted her. Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years and had witnessed 19 pilot deaths linked to engine failure. When Schilling showed him the brass washer, he did not question it. He simply agreed and prepared his tools. The Hurricane sat ready with the pilot inside and the engine running. There were 20 minutes before takeoff. Cooper moved quickly. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and carburetor and placed the restrictor into position. He secured it using a small butane torch. The process took about 60 seconds and the modification was not visible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Schilling inspected the weld and found it clean, strong and correctly done. Squadron leader Davies flew with the restrictor in place. He did not know it was there. Schilling had not informed him and had not told the squadron commander or anyone else except Cooper. If the restrictor failed and Davies was killed, there would be no record, no approval forms and no test data, only a lost pilot and a brass washer that was never authorized. The Hurricane Merlin engine reached full power as Davies completed his pre-flight checks. Oil pressure was stable and coolant temperature was within limits and all 12 cylinders were firing correctly. He released the brakes and the aircraft moved forward, gained speed and lifted into the air. Schilling watched as it climbed through 800 feet, then 1,200 feet and then 2,000 feet. The Hurricane turned south toward the channel. Using binoculars she followed Davies as he climbed to 15,000 feet. 2 more Hurricanes joined him, forming a 3-aircraft patrol. They headed toward Dungeness where German fighters had been active throughout the week. If Davies met a Messerschmitt he would need to dive, and at that moment the restrictor would either perform or fail. Schilling remained on the tarmac with Cooper standing beside her. Neither of them spoke. Ground crews prepared additional Hurricanes for later sorties while a fuel truck moved across the area and mechanics called out instructions. These were the usual sounds of a wartime airfield, yet Schilling focused only on calculations in her mind. She considered fuel flow rates and the 0.04 inch opening and the expected duration of negative G forces. The numbers were correct, but calculations alone could not confirm real combat performance. 40 minutes passed and then an hour with no radio update from Davies. The silence could mean no enemy contact or heavy engagement or the loss of the aircraft. At 0937 the radio came alive with a controller reporting 3 Hurricanes returning within 2 minutes. Schilling lifted her binoculars and saw 3 aircraft approaching. All had returned safely. The Hurricanes entered the landing pattern and Davies touched down first. He taxied to the dispersal area, shut down the engine and stepped out of the cockpit. Schilling walked toward him with unsteady hands. She had worked on engine systems before but had never carried out an unauthorized combat test like this. Davies removed his helmet and appeared pleased, which was not common after patrols. Pilots usually return tired and serious, yet he seemed energized. Cooper asked if there had been any engine issues. Davies looked at him, then at Schilling, and replied that the Merlin had performed better than ever. He explained that he had dived on 2 Messerschmitt aircraft near Dungeness and the engine had continued to run without interruption. Schilling asked him to describe the event in detail. He reported spotting 2 Bf-109 fighters at 14,000 feet, both heading east toward France. Davies had placed his section above the enemy at a higher altitude, which gave him the advantage. He pushed into a steep dive reaching 400 miles per hour. The negative G forces were strong enough to pull him against his harness. This was the type of dive that normally would have caused his engine to fail, yet the Merlin engine continued to run at full power throughout the descent. Davies closed to within 200 yards before the German pilot noticed him. He fired a 3-second burst and observed hits on the left wing of the Messerschmitt. The enemy aircraft broke away sharply to the right and retreated toward France. Davies then pulled up and regained altitude. His engine continued to operate without any issue. This was the first time in 11 months that he had completed a diving attack without engine failure. He wanted to understand what maintenance work had been done to his aircraft. Schilling explained the modification to him and described the restrictor and the way it limited fuel flow. Davies looked at her for several seconds and then spoke to Cooper. He instructed him to install the device in every Hurricane on the station immediately. Schilling pointed out that the modification was not authorized. Davies dismissed the concern. He said that approval did not matter compared to pilot survival. Many pilots at Kenley had already lost friends due to engine failures. 19 pilots had died in 6 months. Davies stated that if military authorities wanted to take action for an unauthorized modification, they could do so after the war. At that moment, the priority was giving pilots reliable engines. Cooper installed the restrictors in 4 additional Hurricanes that afternoon. Schilling had brought 6 units with her and kept 1 aside for further testing. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with the restrictors installed. There were no engine failures. 12 diving attacks were carried out successfully against German fighters. Pilots reported that the Merlin engines performed consistently and even better than expected. Some pilots believed they were receiving increased power at higher altitudes. News of the modification spread quickly. By March 18, all squadron commanders within 11 Group were aware of the restrictor and wanted it installed immediately. Within 2 days, Schilling received 14 phone calls from different stations asking if she could visit and bring more units and how quickly they could be produced. The main issue became production capacity. Schilling had personally machined 6 restrictors in the RAE workshop. Producing them in large numbers would require proper manufacturing facilities along with brass materials, precision equipment and strict quality control. Approval from the Air Ministry and funding were necessary. After 4 days, the Air Ministry approved the proposal and treated it as a high-priority wartime improvement. Rolls-Royce was given the contract to produce the restrictors with a target of 500 units per week. Installation would begin across all fighter stations in Britain without delay. Schilling formed a small team consisting of 3 engineers from Farnborough and 2 civilian mechanics. Their role was to visit RAF stations and supervise installation. The restrictor could be fitted without removing aircraft from service, which was important because all Hurricanes and Spitfires needed to remain active. Although the main phase of the Battle of Britain had ended, German fighters still crossed the Channel daily and Fighter Command could not afford to reduce its operational strength. Schilling prepared her Norton motorcycle with tools and supplies including the restrictors. She had already visited 43 RAF stations before the war and was familiar with the fighter bases across southern England as well as their commanding officers and ground crews. She now planned to visit them again, bringing a simple brass component that would help save pilots' lives. By March 25 the installation teams were ready to begin their work. 600 restrictors had been manufactured. 40 stations were on the schedule. 3,000 Merlin engines were ready for modification. Schilling started her Norton motorcycle and headed north toward Biggin Hill. Biggin Hill was the busiest fighter station in 11 Group with 32 Spitfires and 21 Hurricanes and 4 squadrons rotating through continuous combat operations. Schilling arrived at 0800 on March 26. The station commander Group Captain Grace met her at the gate. He had lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the past 2 months and wanted the restrictors installed without delay. The ground crews worked in shifts with 4 aircraft at a time. Each installation took 12 minutes. The process involved disconnecting the fuel line, placing the restrictor, welding it into position, reconnecting the line and testing for leaks. The weld had to be precise because any failure at altitude could cut off fuel to the engine. Schilling supervised every installation and inspected each weld and connection. She rejected 3 restrictors that did not meet the required standard. Pilots observed the process with close attention. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey had 41 combat missions and had experienced engine failure twice during critical moments in dogfights. He asked Schilling how a simple washer could resolve a complex carburetor issue. She explained the principles of fuel flow and float chamber behavior and the effects of -G on liquid fuel. Lacey understood immediately. He had an engineering degree from Cambridge and described the solution as simple and effective. By March 28 all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had been fitted with restrictors. Schilling then moved on to Hornchurch and North Weald and Tangmere. The same process was repeated at each station. Ground crews continued working 12-hour shifts while pilots flew combat patrols with the modified engines. No engine failures were reported and the restrictor functioned exactly as intended. Pilots began referring to it as Miss Schilling's orifice. The term was introduced by Sir Stanley Hooker, who was chief engineer at the Rolls-Royce Supercharger division. It was a form of informal military humor. Schilling did not object to the name. She had worked with RAF personnel for 6 years and understood how they managed stress. If the nickname helped them remember the modification, she accepted it. The term spread more quickly than the restrictor itself. By April every pilot and unit within Fighter Command knew about Miss Schilling's orifice and many requested it specifically. Some pilots refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had been fitted with the modification and squadron leaders supported this position. They had witnessed too many preventable losses due to engine failure. German intelligence also observed the change in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe after-action reports from early April noted improved RAF diving attacks. British aircraft no longer disengaged during -G maneuvers and German pilots could no longer take advantage of the previous carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage was removed. By mid-April Schilling and her team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines across Hurricanes and Spitfires in Fighter Command, including operational training units and reserve aircraft. The modification became standard equipment and new aircraft leaving the production lines at Castle Bromwich and Southampton were delivered with restrictors already installed. The pressure carburetor was still under development and Rolls-Royce estimated it would be ready for production in 1943. However, the restrictor worked so effectively that some engineers questioned whether the pressure carburetor was still necessary. Why redesign the entire fuel system when a small brass washer could solve the issue? Schilling understood the answer. The restrictor was only a temporary solution even if it was highly effective. The pressure carburetor would fully remove the -G problem. It would allow unrestricted fuel flow and full engine performance in all flight conditions. That was the correct engineering approach. Until 1943 Miss Schilling's orifice kept RAF pilots safe and that was sufficient. The results could be measured clearly. Fighter Command tracked combat statistics in detail, including every engagement, every victory and every loss. In March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF fighters experienced engine failure in 38% of diving attacks against German aircraft. Pilots often had to break off pursuit, allowing enemy fighters to escape. German pilots also used this weakness deliberately by drawing British fighters into dives where their engines would fail. In April 1941, after the restrictor was introduced, engine failures during diving attacks fell to 0.4%. This was nearly eliminated. The few failures that remained were caused by mechanical issues, battle damage, or normal combat losses. The ratio of kills to losses improved immediately. In March, Fighter Command lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires in combat while shooting down 61 German aircraft, which was a ratio of 1.3 to 1. This was barely a balanced outcome. In April 29, British fighters were lost while 94 German aircraft were destroyed, creating a ratio of 3.2 to 1. The restrictor was not the only reason for this improvement, but squadron leaders recognized it as a major factor. Pilots also reported a higher level of confidence during combat. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck flew Spitfires from Duxford. Before the restrictor, he had experienced engine failure 4 times. After installation, he conducted diving attacks without hesitation and destroyed 3 Messerschmitt 109s in May and 2 more in June. He credited the restrictor for giving him the confidence to carry out aggressive maneuvers. The modification was soon adopted beyond Fighter Command. RAF Coastal Command requested restrictors for their aircraft, and Bomber Command requested them for training aircraft. Even the Fleet Air Arm inquired about installing them on carrier-based fighters. Schilling coordinated production with Rolls-Royce, and by June they were producing 1,000 restrictors each week. The restrictor remained in service through 1943 until Rolls-Royce introduced the pressure carburetor in January of that year. The new system fully solved the negative G issue by using fuel injection principles similar to those in German engines. It eliminated the float chamber and provided consistent fuel delivery under all flight conditions. However, converting existing aircraft required major modifications, including removing the old carburetor, installing new fuel pumps, and rewiring engine controls. Each conversion required 8 hours, and during that time the aircraft could not fly combat missions. Fighter Command could not afford to ground its squadrons for long periods, so the restrictors remained in use. Many aircraft continued to operate with Miss Schilling's orifice until 1944, and some used it until the end of the war. New production Spitfires and Hurricanes were fitted with pressure carburetors, but older aircraft kept their restrictors. Pilots trusted them and ground crews were familiar with maintaining them. If a system worked, there was no reason to replace it. Schilling moved on to other engineering challenges. She worked on cold weather starting systems for engines used in Iceland and Russia. She also researched fuel mixture issues at high altitude and contributed to improved supercharger designs for later Merlin engine variants. The Royal Aircraft Establishment assigned her to many technical problems. However, the restrictor remained her most well-known achievement. Pilots remembered it and engineers studied it. After the war, aviation schools used it as an example of practical and effective problem-solving under pressure. It demonstrated a simple solution with immediate implementation and clear measurable results, which reflect strong engineering practice. Keith Maddock, who served as chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, later stated that Schilling played a key role in the war effort and that her contribution was without question significant. The restrictor was considered a war-winning modification. Schilling continued to work on many important challenges at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. These included engine failures at high altitude, fuel icing in extreme cold, and starting difficulties in Arctic conditions. Each issue posed a risk to pilot safety and required solutions. She also worked on cold weather modifications for Spitfires deployed to Murmansk. In Russian winter conditions, temperatures could reach -40°F. Standard engine oil became thick and ineffective, batteries failed, and fuel lines froze. British pilots were unable to start their aircraft, and Soviet ground crews had limited experience with Merlin engines. Schilling developed a cold start method using preheated oil and adjusted fuel mixtures. This solution worked and allowed Spitfires to operate in combat missions over Murmansk during the winter of 1941. She also studied high-altitude performance. Late-war Spitfires operated at altitudes of up to 35,000 feet where the Merlin engine faced challenges due to thin air and low oxygen levels. The fuel mixture had to be precisely controlled. If it was too rich the engine would flood, and if it was too lean it would overheat. Schilling developed carburetor modifications that improved engine power by 8% above 30,000 feet. Her personal life remained separate from her professional work. She married George Naylor in September 1938. He also worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment as an aerodynamicist. When the war began he joined RAF Bomber Command. He flew Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron and completed 31 combat missions over Germany. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing additional missions beyond his required service. Schilling was concerned for his safety each time he flew as bomber losses were extremely high. Bomber Command suffered greater casualties than any other branch of the RAF and approximately 1 in 2 crew members did not survive the war. Naylor survived his missions and returned to Farnborough in 1944. They never discussed his missions and he never asked about her projects. They kept their professional work and marriage in separate areas. Schilling continued riding motorcycles whenever time allowed. She had stopped racing at Brooklands when the war began and the well-known circuit was converted into aircraft production facilities. Even so she still rode her Norton. Fast riding helped her think and solve problems that could not be solved in the laboratory. Some of her strongest engineering ideas came while riding at high speed on country roads. By 1945 she had worked on 17 major projects at Farnborough. These included cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, fuel mixture optimization and supercharger efficiency upgrades. Each project contributed to saving lives and keeping RAF aircraft operational in difficult conditions. However, none of these projects achieved the same recognition as the restrictor. The war ended in May 1945 with the surrender of Germany. Japan followed in August. The Royal Aircraft Establishment shifted from urgent wartime work to peacetime research. The pace became slower and the level of urgency decreased with different priorities. Schilling remained at Farnborough and had no intention of leaving. Engineering was her life and her focus did not change. In 1948 she received formal recognition for her wartime contributions when King George VI appointed her as an officer of the Order of the British Empire. The ceremony was held at Buckingham Palace. Schilling wore formal attire, accepted the medal and took photographs before returning to work at Farnborough the following morning. She continued her work without pause and remained committed to solving technical problems while also proving that women had a place in engineering. Her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment continued for another 21 years. The restrictor remained her most recognized achievement. She worked at the establishment until 1969, completing 33 years of continuous service. She did not reach senior administrative positions because those roles were generally reserved for men. The RAF leadership structure did not promote women to director-level positions regardless of performance. Schilling accepted this limitation and preferred practical engineering work. She focused on laboratory testing, field modifications and solving real problems with practical solutions. After the war her projects included the Blue Streak missile program, which was Britain's first ballistic missile. She worked on fuel delivery systems and high-altitude performance. She also researched braking performance on wet runways for jet aircraft. By the 1950s landing accidents caused more pilot fatalities than engine failures. Understanding how water on runways affected tire friction had the potential to save lives. Schilling published 3 technical papers on this topic. She also contributed to the design of a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team. Although it was an unusual task for an aeronautical engineer, the project involved aerodynamics, weight distribution and friction control, which were areas of her expertise. The RAF team used her design in competition. They did not win medals, but they avoided crashes. Schilling retired in 1969 at the age of 60. In retirement, she restored vintage motorcycles and occasionally raced at classic events while maintaining her Norton. She had kept the same motorcycle since 1930 for the same machine she had raced at Brooklands and the one that taught her how engines behaved under extreme stress. She passed away on November 18, 1990 at the age of 81. She was survived by her husband George and a long list of engineering achievements. British newspapers focused mainly on the restrictor, the brass washer known as Miss Schilling's orifice, while many of her other contributions were given less attention. Her legacy continued in different ways. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Schilling. In 2015, the Brooklands Museum acquired her racing trophies and badges. In 2018, Winchester Heritage recognized her as one of Hampshire's notable women. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrix Schilling Building for electronic engineering students. On March 8, 2019, the mayor of Waterville unveiled a plaque at the local library 110 years after her birth. The restrictor itself became a standard example in engineering education around the world. It demonstrated a simple solution to a complex problem with immediate application during wartime and clear measurable results. It is often cited as an example of effective engineering. Some universities still display original restrictors in museum cases as a reminder that effective solutions do not require unnecessary complexity. If this story had an impact, then support it by liking the video and subscribing. Each interaction helps bring more of these historical accounts to a wider audience. The goal is to share stories of engineers who contributed to saving lives through practical solutions. Viewers are invited to comment and share their location and experiences. This helps build a global community connected through shared interest in history and engineering. This ensures that Beatrix Schilling is remembered and her contributions are not forgotten.